Hey everyone, it's the MiddleGround Mic, and Israel just said it will take all of Gaza, but at what cost? Stay tuned. Happy Monday, everybody. Israel's security cabinet is proposing to occupy pretty much give the Palestinian people no room for movement. In Gaza, they want to start with Gaza City and then, get with the whole enclave. Of course, Netanyahu is claiming it's the speediest way to end the war. You know, and he is saying he's going to give control over to Arab civilian authorities, but he doesn't really have the greatest track record. You know what I mean? Like he just doesn't. I mean, to be fair, Hamas does not either. But this is, I think, going backwards. It's not doing anything to help anybody in Gaza. I think, if anything, it's going to hurt more people. But let's dive into it a little. Security there, and then trying to get the hostages back. Netanyahu and his administration are saying, occupying Gaza is the only way that we can really dismantle Hamas, and possibly rescue the remaining hostages. From what I've heard, they believe some are alive and some are dead. They're talking long-term stability. This is from his administration again. There's certain opinions out there that are saying eliminating Hamas entirely could pave the way for reconstruction stabilization. But even let's say Hamas vanished, right? A lot of these kids are going to have very, very sympathetic feelings towards that because of what's happening to their parents. They're going to be seeing the people who did it to them occupying their homes, or not necessarily their homes, right? But their cities. And that's just not going to go over very well with a lot of people. It's just not. I don't know why anybody would think that okay, because I know in most countries, I'm American, but I know people here would not be okay with that. And if there was somehow an occupation here, I know people would. There would be no woo. Let's go. No, you're just creating more problems down the road. Who is it? Israel's finance minister says that it's going to fail. The Financial Times has reported that Germany is now suspending Gaza-linked arms sales to Israel. As their plans to occupy Gaza are exploding and they're getting massive pushback. I mean, just massive. We kind of talk about it just a little bit more, right? The military overextension. Israel's got a lot going on right now with a lot of the fight that's poked, right? Their leaders are warning that a full occupation could get them into a prolonged warfare, maybe even a guerrilla warfare. And it's going to be increased casualties on both sides. More people are going to needlessly die. It's not needed. It could be entrapment. No, tons of things that could really hurt military morale too, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure they have conscripted service there, or what we call in America the draft. But at some point you're gonna hurt morale among people, right? They're gonna get fatigued, not physical, just mental. When citizenry will too. The enormous cost, right? They're saying it can cost upwards of $10 billion. Some people say crumbling infrastructure. I don't know if it was crumbling before. It probably wasn't in the greatest shape. Excuse me. I'm pretty sure all the bombings made it crumble completely. So yeah, I would say Israel does bear some responsibility to kind of help rebuild it. I know a lot of people would say no, but no, you do with the fact that your military might is so much stronger than theirs, and you're going at it like a crazy person. Not that I'm not calling Israelis crazy themselves, but it's just more of a metaphor, right? I believe there's like 1.5 or 2 million residents in the Gaza Strip. Like, it's a lot of people. And the track record in this war, I don't see very many people getting taken care of like they should. The military, God rest their soul, and hopefully things work out and they can all find peace and coexistence. And it's a lot of responsibility, right? I mean, they're going to have a lot of problems with the other Arab nations. I am pretty sure they'll put a lot of tension on every single situation involved. And when I say every single situation, it's the humanitarian. It's going to be a catastrophe, flat out. I mean, look at it. They killed aid workers supposedly by accident. I would hope so. it could cause it turn into, it was already a rough area, right? An inhumane ghetto where they lucky to even have water, right? It could get even worse than it is now. And I don't know how, but the famine and the displacement and these people having to go to different countries where they themselves might not even be welcomed. So not only did they get put out of their homes, their land, now they're being forced to seek refuge in countries that may be hostile towards them. That's not right. I get what Hamas did to Israel is wrong, 1,000% wrong. And Israel's response to me was justified initially, but now it's exaggerated. It's gone on too long, and we need to do better. Just think about your own kids, your own family. Nobody wants to deal with that. I live not that far from Dearborn, Michigan. I know a lot of Arabs. I know a lot of people of Palestinian descent. And they're good people. I'm not saying that people in Hamas are good people. No, I'm not saying that at all. But there's a lot more good people there than there is Hamas, right? I mean, come on. It's going to create more isolationism from other governments and the international community. And I'm guessing international law is definitely going to become very, very complicated with an occupation. You know, there's UN bodies that are saying, that it is illegal. Well, I mean, here's the UN says, a lot of things are illegal, but I don't know if I'd really trust the UN as a source of advice on that. It's definitely rough. I don't see the International Criminal Justice Court doing anything. I know all these people supposedly deem that they can't, right? I'm pretty sure that Benjamin Netanyahu has a quote unquote international warrant issued to him, but they, I know if I'm correct, they have audio tape on him and some other sort of proof for Benjamin Netanyahu taking bribes while he's been in office. And so there's some rumors that he doesn't want the war to end because if he leaves office, then he could possibly put on trial or arrested. I mean, that could definitely pose definite conflict of interest. I really just hope for peace. I believe President Trump, hate him or love him, did negotiate peace between two countries, and I believe they announced the deal on Friday, the 8th, or yesterday, Saturday, the 9th. One of the 2 days they announced peace. I got to take a little drink of the MiddleGround coffee mug here. If you want one, let me know. So, there is some peace things happening. So, hopefully more peace happens and we can come to a resolution here soon. And hopefully the Arab community can get involved in the Middle East and to find some kind of coexistence thing with Israel. Um, kind of talking about war, we'll switch over to the other one, right? It's definitely concerning. The Ukraine Russia war is something that Trump has been trying to get rid of. He's definitely had some frustration with Putin that he's put out there. The upcoming meeting between him and Putin, obviously they're going to discuss Ukraine, potential territorial concessions. And I know a lot of allies and not just Europe, but a lot of the around the world are, it's alarming. It's concerning to them. From my understanding, and again, I don't live in Crimea, nothing of that nature, and I'm not or from my understanding, is a lot of people in Crimea speak Russian and they would prefer to be part of Russia. Now, is that a starting point? We can be like, hey, is this the case? Can we start here? Right? That's not easy for anybody to say. That'd be like us saying, hey, let's give up a state to Canada. But depending on the situation, if it may be something you need to explore, depending how things look, right? They like when it comes to Ukraine, I believe the Trump administration or well, our government, not just they just approved, I think 650 million in additional arms aid for Ukraine for July, adding to the 310 million they already offered them back in May. As part of the broader, aid program that was given to them. Public sentiment in Ukraine toward us, our leadership here has dipped because obviously Trump's a little bit more critical of Ukraine's role than Biden was. Biden was a little bit more unilaterally, hey, everything's one way, the situation's one way. There's very, very little criticism of how Ukraine approaches things. Or there's criticism on both sides always. I mean, even if you didn't start, there's always criticisms of how you handle something. You're not perfect. I believe, 70% of Ukrainians still want America involved in the peace talks. So that's a big deal, right? But, I personally think, and again, this is just personal opinion out of ignorance, I think Crimea, with its history, would be a good starting point. Maybe give up the territorial conflict with it. I mean, I know Russia occupied it and stuff, but maybe like, hey, okay, boom, it's done. Carve out a new map. It is what it is. That I think that would be a good starting point. And then obviously, financially incentivize it, right? If you really, 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 really want to get to Russia, coffee mug, you know, Trump put the 50% tariff on Indian products. I'm going to use what I'm going to call now the Kevin O'Leary approach, where it's just a quick tidbit. Kevin O'Leary proposed to get China to the table to get a trade deal done way faster, slap 400% tariffs on their stuff. Because at that point, it would have put Xi Jinping in a really bad spot. People would have, he might not have been in power if he didn't do something about it, right? So if we really, really, really want to put the cramp down on Russia, and we're talking about India, and I'm not anti-India by any means, but if that's your goal, take the Kevin O'Leary approach. 400% tariffs, boom, on everything coming out of that country, services, goods, everything. And I think you will find India will come to the table. Because a lot of outside of energy, a lot of India's trade comes from the United States. And then at that point, I would look at Putin and be like, hey, we can definitely make things easier. You come to the table for the peace talks, you bring up Crimea, you bring up easing the issues with India, so that way they can have somebody purchasing their oil to fund their treasury. I think that would be a good spot, not just 50%. You've got to make it so that if that tariff goes into effect, it is going to hurt. It can't just be this. No, it needs to hurt if you want meaningful action. I'm not advocating anybody physically getting hurt, but, I mean, even give like a 30, 60-day thing, like, hey, in 60 days, if we don't got some kind of concrete plan for the peace to actually be enabled to stick more than just a, hey, we're going to the grocery store today type of thing. No, it's got to be boom, boom, boom. And they all have to commit and stick to it, both sides, not just Russia. Ukraine has to keep up to their end as well, which I think at this point, a lot of citizens there would be more than willing. People are tired of seeing their neighbors dying. I'm pretty sure a lot of Russians are tired of seeing their fellow Russians dying. They need to do better, and $650 million is a lot of money that we're sending over there. We're talking about Doge in America and stuff. Well, and I get a lot of people who want us involved, but that's $650 million. That's money we could be using towards some of the Medicaid cuts that people have talked about, right? That could be money we're using towards infrastructure without having to borrow more money to do it, right? $30 billion could go a long way to building a lot of things in this country. So I think that's definitely something that the United States needs to really take seriously. They've really got to do better with this whole Ukraine thing. I mean, like, look at with Gaza, right? They're already, Germany's already cutting weapons off to them. There we go. Um, and it's going to get to the point. I believe Zelensky was in Russia, and so a lot of Europeans are afraid, hey, he's not at the peace talks, this, that, and the other thing. European leaders are putting pressure on Russia, ahead of the peace talks, right? They're stressing the need to Trump. Europeans are, I should say, their leaders, to protect Ukrainian interests. Russians are cheering Putin's Alaska invitation. They're not envisioning any real concessions on Ukraine, which I think is very, if that's your starting point, you might as well just cancel the thing, go home, and just hand Ukraine a bunch of weapons and everything, and just tell them to go ham. If that's the case, I mean, if you're walking in the door and you're not willing to meet in the middle, like this podcast says, meet in the middle ground, if that is not even an option for you, then those talks are doomed to fail. All it is political hot air. I mean, we get plenty of that around the world, especially here in America, but, given our country's size, but we shouldn't even be entertaining it if it's hot air. Put more pressure on, like I said, man, really put the pressure on in India. Punch that financial hit. Punch it. And you will get the peace that we're seeking. Kevin O'Leary was right with his approach on China, man. You got to go, bam. You got to get their attention. It can't just be something that's a back and forth, tit for tat thing. No, it's got to be, boom, we're coming to the table and we're solving this problem. If not, this is what's going to happen. That's what we need right now. And it's not that I'm against diplomacy. I'm all for diplomacy. I'm all for diplomacy before any kind of war, any kind of tariff, any kind of action like that, right? But if they're already coming to the table saying they're not going to make a concession, What choice do you have? What choice do you have at that point, right? So if that's the case, we need to be in unison with Europe once we get to that point. Europe will need to take similar actions against India because India provides a lot of services and goods and things like that to Europe as well, right? And we're not trying to hurt anybody from India. I'm not advocating hurt any Indians because my best friend, he's Indian. His parents are from India. But if you're trying to get that message across, right? Like you're really trying to put that squeeze on Russia, we could even say, hey, 400% tariffs, but we'll sell you oil cheap, da da da. I don't know, something of that nature, right? We got to really get that part going. Trump and Putin are scheduled to meet on August 15th. They want to make sure everybody's interests, especially the security interests, are all involved, right? Obviously, I think that to me, maybe it's not to whoever's setting the stuff up, but to me, it's kind of like a duh to include Zelensky. Like, why wouldn't you include President Zelensky? It's his country. He's got to be willing to come to some sort of agreement too in order for this to work. So if you're not doing that, all you're doing is you're just wasting time. And he's even said any deal that's made without him being involved is dead on arrival. To be fair, even though I'm opposed to this war and I think Ukraine needs to make concessions, he's not wrong. How can you expect me to come to a deal? I'm not your lapdog. And if we're already dying, I know that's just not how this is going to work. And that's very fair from him. Europeans and their allied states, they're continuing to say, hey, no to Russia on their CSER terms, right? Because they're not including an immediate halt to hostilities, and participation in Ukrainian negotiations. The drone warfare is surging between both sides, and drone warfare can cause a lot more damage just due to the non-human factor. It's just, in order to get peace, I mean, when you're kind of thinking about it, Russia has presented broad ceasefire terms, but everybody in the West, United States, Europe, Western leaning nations, most of them, not everybody, okay, they're rejecting any reward from the aggression. Like they don't believe in rewarding you. But I mean, if we can just stop everything for this moment, maybe is a little financial pressure to get the guns to go stop. Maybe it's something worth looking at. Zelensky is reiterating that Ukraine would never cede land to bring about peace. The only thing I'm saying, I think he needs to change that stance on, and again, opinion out of ignorance, is Crimea, just based on the history, from what I understand about the people there. You know, there's there's a lot of tension. Um, the battlefield updates change all the time, just depending on, which way is going what. But there's renewed renewed offensives throughout Ukraine. So that's definitely a problem. Outside support's intensifying. Russia's drone affair, their drone capability is getting way bigger. I believe Germany said that Russia could launch up to like 1,500 to 2,000 drones at one time to put that much pressure on Ukrainian defenses. There's just a lack of trust there. It's just something we have to do a better job at. Ukraine is standing firm. There's no giveaways on it from them. They're not no shortcuts. This is diplomacy's real test, and it's a test if the world will back that resolve, or let negotiations slip into dangerous ambiguity, obscurity, pretty much being pointless. So hopefully that, on the 15th when they do this, we'll even do another segment after that talks about that, right? And we'll kind of see where those talks go. Right, kind of let's switch it up just a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about RFK, one of my favorite subjects, the Maha movement, right? Like I've said, I'm somebody that has struggled with weight before, but now I'm taking certain actions and now that I'm paying attention a little bit more. And I won't say it's necessarily Maha advice, but it's helped me lose weight, right? I mean, it is. So, he's ordered the cancellation of 22 federal contracts totaling $500 million for mRNA vaccine projects, signaling deep shifts in preventative healthcare policy. There's a lot of criticism over the mRNA vaccines. Let me see if I can pull up the one statistic here. I thought I had that right in front of me. They're saying they reviewed the science and that there are people there, but obviously, a lot of the people in there now are definitely more pro his policies. Oh, that can be a little skewed. You know, they're saying if you're vaccinated against things like COVID-19, you're less likely to get infected. Well, that's part of why people don't call it a vaccine, right? If you get the measles vaccine, I mean, it's next to impossible for you to get it, right? And people aren't taking that and they're getting it. But with COVID, you're less likely to get it. But that's what they're saying, right? But what they were saying for a long time, and it's still true now, they just reworded it, is it'll, if you do get it, it won't be as bad. I don't know about a lot of people. And listen, I got the first two shots of the Pfizer one. And after I had COVID before that, it was nothing like after I got that. After I got shots, it was insanely terrible for me. I mean, I was down for the count. I was miserable, miserable. It was awful. And I'm not necessarily blaming the vaccine. All I know is it did not do what they said it would for me. I'm not telling people to get it. I'm not telling people not to get it. I'm just sharing my experience with it. I just know that there has been a lot of criticism of that version of the vaccine, right? mRNA is supposed to this is what it's supposed to do. It delivers genetic instructions onto the host cells, prompting them to produce a harmless decoy of the pathogen to train the immune system to fight the real thing. It's been in development for decades. They were propelled from lab benches to widespread use, during Donald Trump's first term through Operation Warp Speed, that try to get the COVID vaccine to everybody's hands, So, but I think now that some things are coming out, a lot of people are not okay with it. I mean, now that I've learned more about it, it's definitely not something I'm like, woo, woo, let's keep doing it. No, and some people are saying that he's dismantling evidence based structures and, it's sparking alarm in the healthcare community. And there's a lot of questions about something. I don't know if that's necessarily um, a bad thing. I think we need to always question everything. You know, RFK saying that we should be shifting towards a more safer platform, and he's advocating to a broader platforms that mimic natural immunity. I know a lot of those are the more traditional type vaccines. I don't know the certain wording of it, so I don't want to say it. Obviously he's going to get a lot of support from the anti-mRNA advocates such as Child's Health Defense. They're championing it as a victory move for public health freedom. To be fair, a lot of doctors, pediatricians, I should say, are financially incentivized to push the vaccines on you, and certain insurers and things like that won't give them what they're supposed to get financially from services if they don't do it. I don't know if that's the right thing to do, right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't be telling them hey, we need to be giving vaccines out. I just don't know if we should be allowing finances to be involved in that situation. Because even if there isn't really a lot of shady things going on there, that definitely will create the perception of corruption. That will give that perception 1,000 times over. Um, obviously, critics are saying there's a lot of public health risk, national security threats to it, from just public health judgment to pandemic preparedness, being ready to respond to any kind of bio situations. It's going to hinder innovation. It'll spur a US brain drain, which we can definitely not afford. If there is an emergency, it's going to slow down the response, right? mRNA vaccines are, they're fast. They're easy to develop fast. And it's a double-edged sword, right? But you're also putting something fast that attaches up to people's genes and things. That's, don't know about it. I guess that's the part where I get a little uncomfortable. And it does erode public trust, though, to be fair. The move could really push further the partisanship in America. It's going to reduce confidence in vaccine technologies, which a lot of them are good, especially among skeptical groups. I'm not anti vax at all. I definitely think we should spread it out a little bit more, kind of see where that goes. I definitely am not saying no to vaccines, not by any measure. You can take that one to the bank there. We're going to kind of talk a little bit about an uplifting statistic in the United States, right? I don't want to say uplifting statistic, right? But I think that there's a lot of hope for the future because I feel like Generation Z, I believe it's called. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of criticism. Some of the woke stuff and things of that nature definitely is kind of like, yeah, but the one thing I see with them is I see that they're very passionate. They care a lot more than the media and everybody gives them credit for. I work with a lot of people from that generation. They're not understood very well. If you can connect with them right, they will work hard. So there is hope for the future. There is hope. Take a look at your neighbor's kids, not the one that always gets in trouble, but take a one that seems good. And remember that that kid is probably part of that generation or a generation after that. So give them the benefit of the doubt. If they're a good kid, give them some support. Give them a pat on the back if they need it. Hey, that's how we're going to build better kids in this country. Even ones that we don't, that may not agree with you politically, if they're good kids and they're doing the right thing, try to support them. They need that. All kids need that. They need that neighbor to say, hey, man, good job, right? Because you don't talk to that neighbor every day. So it comes off a little bit different than the person you see all the time does a good job. The person you see all the time, you may be kind of like, oh, thanks. You might appreciate it. But person you don't see all the time, somebody that may not always agree with on something, when they turn around and tell that kid, good job, it hits different for that kid. That kid's going to appreciate it a whole lot. And it's going to really impact. So that's your middle ground mic wrap, Israel's battle for Gaza, RFK's health shakeup, that's kind of, we get a little bit of a real time look at the war in Ukraine and a hopeful note about our country's future. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and let us know what you want us to dig into next. People who start commenting on YouTube or send us a text via the podcast, things of that nature, you will be entered into a special prize pool. We've got some tumblers to give away, things of that nature. All you got to do is like, subscribe, comment. We got to have some comments on there, right? We got to try to boost that visibility. I hope this just catches everybody doing well, and I hope everybody has a good day.